General Robert Thompson had served his country for 30 years with honor and dedication. Today was different, though. Today, he was not wearing his military uniform with its shining stars and ribbons. Instead, he was just a regular man in blue jeans and a simple white t-shirt, driving his old Honda through the peaceful town of Millbrook. He was on his way to visit his elderly mother. Something he tried to do every month when his busy schedule allowed. The warm July afternoon sun felt good on his face as it streamed through the car windows. Robert had been driving for 3 hours straight from Washington, D.C., and his back was getting stiff. When he saw Mike's gas station ahead, he decided it was time for a break. The small station looked quiet and friendly, with its red and white sign and a few old-fashioned gas pumps out front. Robert pulled his car up to pump number 3 and turned off the engine. He sat for a moment, enjoying the silence after the long drive. Through the station window, he could see an elderly man behind the counter reading a newspaper. A few local residents were coming and going, filling up their cars and buying snacks. It seemed like a typical small-town afternoon. Stepping out of his car, Robert stretched his long legs and rolled his shoulders to work out the tension. At 55 years old, he was still in excellent shape from decades of military training, but the long drives were getting harder on his body. He was a tall man, about 6 feet 2 inches, with kind brown eyes that had seen both the beauty and hardship of the world. His hair was mostly black but had turned gray at the temples, giving him a distinguished look that commanded respect wherever he went. Robert carried himself with quiet dignity and confidence. It was the same way he had walked since joining the army as an 18-year-old boy from a small farming town in Georgia. Back then, he had been scared and uncertain about his future. Now, after 3 decades of service, he was one of the most respected generals in the Pentagon. But today, in his civilian clothes, he looked like any other middle-aged man stopping for a gas stop as Robert began filling his tank. He noticed the police car pulling into the station parking lot. He didn't think much of it at first. Police officers often stopped at gas stations during their patrols. It was part of their normal routine to check on local businesses and make sure everything was safe. Officer Daniel Hayes stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his uniform belt as he walked. Daniel was only 24 years old and had been on the Millbrook police force for just 3 months. He was still learning the job and felt enormous pressure to prove himself to his senior officers. Every call, every interaction felt like a test that he might fail. Daniel had grown up in Millbrook, and, like many small towns, it had its problems with old-fashioned thinking. His father, who had worked at the local factory for 40 years, had filled Daniel's head with unfair ideas about people who looked different from them. These were lessons Daniel had never questioned, even though deep down something told him they were wrong. When Daniel saw Robert at the gas station, something uncomfortable stirred inside his chest. The old fears and prejudices that his father had taught him began to surface like poison rising in his throat. Instead of seeing a fellow American citizen, Daniel saw only what his narrow worldview allowed him to see. His police training, which had taught him to treat all people with respect and fairness, was suddenly forgotten. Daniel walked across the parking lot, his hand resting on his belt near his radio and other equipment. His heart was beating faster than it should have been, and he felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the pleasant weather. "Excuse me, sir," Daniel called out, his voice much sharper and more aggressive than it needed to be. "Can I see some identification?" Robert turned, round with a gentle, patient smile. He had been through situations like this before, unfortunately. Even when wearing his full military dress uniform with all his medals and ribbons, some people still saw only what their prejudices wanted them to see. It was always disappointing. But Robert had learned long ago that responding with anger or frustration only made things worse. "Of course, officer," Robert replied in his calm, steady voice. "Is there a problem I can help you with?" Daniel's jaw tightened as he heard Robert's polite response for some reason. The kindness in Robert's voice only made him more suspicious and angry. "Just checking," Daniel replied, his voice getting colder. "You look suspicious to me." Robert remained perfectly calm, just as his military training had taught him. He reached slowly and carefully for his wallet, making sure to keep his movements visible and non-threatening. He had learned over the years that sudden movements could escalate these situations quickly and dangerously. "Here's my driver's license," Robert said softly, holding out the plastic card. But Daniel's mind was already made up. His better judgment was clouded by the poisonous ideas his father had planted in his mind years ago. He saw only what his prejudices allowed him to see, not the distinguished veteran who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting the very country Daniel had sworn to serve. The warm, peaceful afternoon was about to turn cold and difficult for both men. Though neither of them knew it yet, the tension at Mike's gas station was growing thicker by the minute. Daniel Hayes stood facing Robert Thompson, his hand still resting nervously on his police belt. Other customers at the gas station had begun to notice the commotion and were watching from a safe distance. Some were whispering to each other, wondering what was happening. Robert remained perfectly still, his hands clearly visible at his sides. He had been in much more dangerous situations during his military career, but this felt different somehow. This was happening in his own country, among his own people. It reminded him of stories his grandfather had told him about the old days, stories he had hoped belonged to the past. Daniel was feeling more confused and angry by the second. He had expected Robert to become upset or defensive, but instead the man remained calm and respectful. This only made Daniel more suspicious in his limited experience. He thought innocent people should be more nervous when questioned by police. Robert's composure seemed strange to him. Just then, another police car pulled into the gas station with its lights flashing. The backup that Daniel had called for had arrived. Officer Margaret Wilson stepped out of her patrol car and immediately began walking toward them. Margaret was 52 years old and had been working as a police officer in Millbrook for 20 years. She had seen almost everything during her long career and had developed a keen sense for when situations were going wrong. Margaret could tell from 50 feet away that something was not right about this encounter. Daniel looked nervous and agitated, while the civilian appeared calm but cautious. Her experienced eyes took in the scene quickly, noting the body language of both men. "Daniel, what's going on here?" Margaret asked in her steady, professional voice. She had trained many young officers over the years and had learned that staying calm was the key to resolving difficult situations. Daniel turned toward his senior officer, relief flooding his face. He had been hoping that backup would help him figure out how to handle this situation. This man was acting suspicious, Daniel replied, though his voice was shaking slightly. Deep down, he was beginning to realize that he might have made a serious mistake, but his pride would not let him back down now. Margaret looked at Daniel with concern. In her 20 years on the force, she had learned to trust her instincts, and right now her instincts were telling her that Daniel had gotten himself into trouble. She turned her attention to Robert, studying him more carefully. Robert stood with his hands still visible, his posture showing respect but not fear. "Officers, I'm just traveling through your town to visit my mother," he said in calm, measured tones. "I stopped here to get gas and stretch my legs. I'm happy to cooperate with you in any way I can." Something about Robert's manner of speaking caught Margaret's attention. His voice had a quality that reminded her of her own son, who was serving. As a sergeant in the army overseas, there was a certain discipline and respect in the way Robert spoke that seemed familiar to her. She also noticed a small American flag pin on his jacket that she had missed at first. Margaret had always supported the military and had great respect for the men and women who served their country. Her own father had been a veteran of the Korean War, and she had grown up hearing stories about military service and sacrifice. The flag pin on Robert's jacket made her pause and reconsider the situation. "Sir, may I please see your identification?" Margaret asked, her tone much more respectful than Daniel's had been. She wanted to handle this properly and professionally, the way she had been trained to do. Robert nodded and carefully reached into his back pocket to pull out his wallet. He handed it to Margaret with steady hands, maintaining eye contact to show that he had nothing to hide. Margaret opened the brown leather wallet and looked inside for his driver's license. What she saw inside the wallet made her eyes widen with shock. There was indeed a driver's license, but there was also something else that made her heart skip a beat. Nestled behind the driver's license was a military identification card. And when Margaret read what was printed on it, she could hardly believe her eyes. "Daniel," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this right now." Daniel stepped closer, wondering what Margaret had found that could be so important. Margaret held up the military ID card so that Daniel could read it clearly. The plastic card was official and impressive, with the seal of the United States only prominently displayed. The card read, "General Robert Thompson, United States Army, Pentagon." Margaret's hands began to tremble slightly as she looked from the ID card back to Robert's face. This was not just any ordinary citizen they had stopped. This was not just any veteran or retired soldier. This was one of the highest-ranking military officers in the entire country, a man who worked at the Pentagon and helped make decisions about national security. Daniel's face went completely pale as the full weight of what he had done began to sink into his mind. He had just confronted and treated with suspicion a 3-star general in the United States Army. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he felt his knees grow weak beneath him. Word of what had happened at Mike's gas station spread through the Millbrook Police Department like wildfire. By evening, every officer in the small department had heard about the incident involving Officer Daniel Hayes and the man who turned out to be a Pentagon general. The story grew more detailed with each telling, and the weight of the situation became clearer to everyone. Chief William Carter had been at home eating dinner with his family when he received the phone call from Margaret Wilson. At first, he thought she might be playing some kind of joke on him. The 3-star general stopped and questioned at a gas station in their quiet little town. It seemed impossible, but Margaret's serious tone told him this was no joke. Chief Carter was 62 years old and had dedicated 25 years of his life to serving the Millbrook community. He was known throughout the town as a fair and honest man who treated everyone with respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. He had worked hard to build trust between the police department and the community. And now he feared that all of that work might be undone by one terrible mistake. That evening, Chief Carter called an emergency meeting at the police station. He wanted to understand exactly what had happened and figure out how to handle the situation properly. The meeting room felt heavy with tension as the few officers on duty gathered round the conference table. The next morning, General Robert Thompson sat in Chief Carter's office, still wearing the same civilian clothes from the day before, despite not being in uniform. His military bearing was evident in everything he did. He sat straight in his chair, his hands folded calmly in his lap, and spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to command. Chief Carter looked across his desk at the general. feeling a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and deep regret. He had reviewed the body camera footage from the incident 3 times during the night, and each viewing had made him feel worse about what his officer had done. "General Thompson," Chief Carter said, his voice heavy with genuine regret, "I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for what happened to you yesterday. There is absolutely no excuse for the way you were treated." Robert nodded thoughtfully, his kind eyes showing no anger or desire for revenge. He had spent the night thinking about the incident and what it meant, not just for him personally, but for the broader issues it represented. "Chief Carter, I appreciate your apology," Robert replied in his calm, steady voice. "I want you to know that I've faced discrimination before. Unfortunately, even while wearing my military uniform. What concerns me most is not what happened to me yesterday, but what happens to other people who don't have my rank and position to protect them." The chief felt his heart sink as he realized the full implications of what Robert was saying. How many other people had been treated unfairly by his officers? How many incidents had happened that he never heard about because the victims didn't have the power or influence to make their voices heard? Robert had declined to press criminal charges against Daniel, though he certainly had every right to do so. The incident had been recorded on body cameras, and the footage was clear and deeply troubling to watch. It showed a young officer letting his prejudices guide his actions instead of his training and professional duty. While Robert and Chief Carter were having their difficult conversation at the police station, Daniel Hayes sat at his kitchen table at home, staring at his police badge. The small metal shield that had once filled him with pride now seemed to mock him. He had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as he replayed the encounter over and over in his mind. His wife Emma sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She was 26 years old, the same age as Daniel, and they had been married for just 2 years. Emma worked as a nurse at the local hospital and had always been proud of her husband's decision to become a police officer. She believed in helping people and thought Daniel shared that same desire to serve his community. "I was raised better than this," Daniel whispered to Emma, his voice barely audible. Tears were forming in his eyes as he struggled with the shame and guilt he felt. "My mother taught me to treat everyone with respect and kindness. She taught me that a person's character is what matters, not the color of their skin or how they dress." How did I forget something so important? Emma squeezed his hand gently, her heart breaking for her husband's pain. "People make mistakes, Daniel," she said softly. "Even good people sometimes do wrong things. The question now is not what you did yesterday, but what you choose to do next." Back at the police station, Officer Margaret Wilson was having her own difficult conversation with Chief Carter. Margaret had been thinking all night about what she had witnessed, and she knew that changes needed to be made immediately. "This cannot happen again," Margaret said firmly, her voice filled with conviction. "We need better training for our officers, better understanding of the communities we serve. We need to do more than just teach procedures and laws. We need to teach our officers to see the humanity in every person they encounter." Chief Carter nodded slowly, knowing that Margaret was absolutely right. "I agree completely, Margaret," he said. "But the real question is, how do we change hearts and minds, not just procedures and policies?" 3 weeks had passed since the difficult encounter at Mike's gas station. During that time, General Robert Thompson had done a lot of thinking about what had happened and what it meant for the future. Many people expected him to simply leave Millbrook behind and forget about the incident. After all, he was a busy man with important responsibilities at the Pentagon. But Robert had other plans. Instead of walking away, Robert made a decision that surprised everyone. He contacted Chief Carter and requested a meeting. But this was not going to be a meeting in the police station or in some formal government office. Robert wanted something different. He wanted to meet in a place where real healing could begin. The meeting was arranged to take place at the Millbrook Community Center, a friendly building in the heart of town where local residents gathered for various events and activities. The community center felt like neutral ground, a place where people could come together as equals rather than as authority figures and citizens on the day of the meeting. Daniel Hayes drove to the community center with his stomach full of butterflies. He had no idea what to expect from this encounter. Would the general be angry with him? Would he demand that Daniel be fired from the police force? Daniel's hands were shaking as he parked his car and walked toward the building inside the community center. Robert was already waiting in a small meeting room. He had arrived early and spent a few minutes looking round the room, which was decorated with pictures of local families and community events. The walls told the story of Millbrook, showing neighbors helping neighbors and people of all backgrounds working together. When Daniel entered the room, he felt his heart beating fast. He was nervous and ashamed, still struggling with the guilt of what he had done. He looked across the room and saw Robert sitting calmly at a round table, wearing a simple blue shirt and khaki pants. Once again, the general looked like any other citizen, not like one of the most powerful military officers in the country. "Officer Hayes," Robert said, standing up and extending his hand with a warm smile. "Thank you for coming today. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." Daniel stopped in his tracks, completely surprised by Robert's friendly greeting. He had expected anger or coldness, but instead he was being treated with kindness and respect. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then reached out and shook Robert's offered hand. "Sir, I don't know what to say," Daniel stammered, his voice filled with emotion. "I was wrong. Completely and totally wrong. There's no excuse for how I treated you that day." Robert's eyes were kind but serious as he gestured for Daniel to sit down at the table. "Daniel, may I call you that?" Robert asked. When Daniel nodded, Robert continued, "I want you to know that I'm not here today looking for apologies. I'm here because I believe we can turn this painful moment into something meaningful and positive. Over the next hour, Robert began to share his own personal story with Daniel. He talked about growing up as a poor child in rural Georgia, where his family struggled to make ends meet. He described facing discrimination and prejudice throughout his life, even after he had achieved success and recognition in the military. "When I was your age," Robert said, "people would look at me and see only what they expected to see. They didn't see my dreams, my hard work, or my dedication to serving my country. They saw only the surface and made judgments based on their own fears and misunderstandings." Robert explained how the military had taught him that a person's character and actions were what truly mattered, not their appearance or background. He had learned to judge people by their integrity, their courage, and their willingness to serve others. "I want to start a program," Robert explained, his voice growing more excited as he shared his vision. "I want to create a partnership between military veterans and police departments. Not to criticize or blame, but to share our experiences and help officers understand the importance of seeing the person behind the uniform, or behind the lack of a uniform." Daniel listened carefully to every word Robert spoke. He was amazed by the general's wisdom and compassion, and he found himself feeling hopeful for the first time since the incident occurred. "General," Daniel said quietly, "I have to ask you something. Why would you want to help me after what I did to you? Why would you care about making me a better officer?" Robert smiled gently, his eyes twinkling with warmth. Because I believe that people can change. Daniel, I believe that good people sometimes make bad mistakes. But those mistakes don't have to define who they are for the rest of their lives. Your mistake doesn't define you unless you choose to let it. Just then, Officer Margaret Wilson entered the room, followed by Chief Carter. Margaret had been quiet during most of the meeting, listening and learning from Robert's words. But now she felt compelled to speak up. "I'd like to be part of this program too," Margaret said firmly. "We need this kind of training and understanding in our department. We need to do better." Chief Carter nodded his agreement enthusiastically. "General Thompson, you have my complete and total support for this program. Whatever you need from us, you'll have it. What can we do to get started?" 6 months had passed since the difficult afternoon at Mike's gas station, and the world looked very different now. What had started as a painful encounter between two men had grown into something much larger and more meaningful than anyone could have imagined. The Uniform of Character program, as Robert had decided to name it, had spread far beyond the small town of Millbrook. 12 police departments across 3 different states had embraced the program and were seeing remarkable results. Word was spreading through law enforcement communities about this innovative approach to training and community building. General Robert Thompson had made the biggest decision of his life. After 30 years of distinguished military service, he had chosen to retire from active duty at the Pentagon. Many of his colleagues thought he was making a mistake, walking away from a prestigious career at the height of his influence. But Robert knew in his heart that this new mission was the most important work he had ever done. "This is my real service to my country," Robert would tell people who asked about his decision. "Teaching people to see each other as human beings first. That's what will make America stronger." The transformation in Daniel Hayes was nothing short of remarkable. The young officer who had let fear and prejudice guide his actions 6 months earlier was now a completely different person. Daniel had thrown himself into learning and growing, determined to become the kind of officer his community deserved. Daniel underwent extensive additional training, not just in police procedures, but in understanding different cultures and backgrounds. He spent hours volunteering in the community, getting to know the people he had sworn to protect and serve. He visited schools, community centers, and local businesses, building genuine relationships with residents of all ages and backgrounds. Most surprisingly, Daniel had become one of the program's most effective advocates. When he spoke to groups of police officers about the dangers of prejudice and bias, his words carried special weight because of his own experience. He was not a perfect person lecturing others about their flaws. He was someone who had made a serious mistake and learned from it. "I was that officer who let fear and ignorance guide my actions," Daniel would tell training groups with complete honesty. "I let the wrong voices in my head tell me who to trust and who to fear. But I learned something important that day. Every single person we encounter deserves our respect, regardless of how they look, how they dress, or where they come from." The program itself was beautifully simple but incredibly effective. It paired experienced military veterans with police officers for various activities. Sometimes they would go on ride-alongs together, patrolling neighborhoods and responding to calls. Other times they would attend community events, meeting residents and building positive relationships. But the most important part of the program was the honest conversations about bias, humanity, and service. Veterans would share their experiences from serving alongside people of all backgrounds, while police officers would talk about the challenges they faced in their daily work. These conversations helped everyone involved understand that their common goal was serving and protecting their communities. Officer Margaret Wilson had found her calling as a program coordinator. Her 20 years of police experience, combined with her natural ability to connect with people, made her perfect for bridging the gap between military and civilian law enforcement. Margaret traveled from department to department, helping to establish new programs and train other coordinators. The most beautiful thing about this program, Margaret would often say, is watching people discover that they have more in common than they ever realized. On a bright and sunny Saturday morning in spring, Robert stood before a graduating class of police recruits at the State Training Academy. The large auditorium was filled with young men and women who had just completed months of intensive training and were about to begin their careers in law enforcement. In the front row, sitting with perfect posture and wearing his crisp uniform, was Daniel Hayes, 6 months earlier. He had been a confused and misguided rookie officer. Now, he was Sergeant Hayes, a training instructor who would help shape the next generation of police officers. Robert looked out at the sea of fresh faces before him, remembering his own graduation from military training so many years ago. These young people were full of hope and determination, ready to make a positive difference in their communities. Remember this moment, Robert told the graduating class, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. Remember the oath you took and the promise you made to serve all people fairly and with respect. The badge you wear represents service to every single person in your community. When you look at someone during your career, try to see not what divides us from each other, but what connects us together. We all have families we love, dreams we want to achieve, and challenges we must face. After the graduation ceremony ended, Daniel approached Robert near the stage. Even though they had worked together closely for months, Daniel still felt grateful every time he saw the man who had changed his life. "General, I need to thank you again for believing in me," Daniel said, with sincere emotion in his voice. Robert shook his head with a warm, understanding smile. "No thanks needed, Daniel. We are all just trying to serve our communities better and become the best versions of ourselves." That evening, as Robert drove home through Millbrook, he passed by Mike's gas station where everything had begun. He smiled as he thought about how one difficult and painful moment had somehow grown into something beautiful and meaningful. The end.